Welcome to Church Planting and Renewal Conversations. I'm Chris Vogel, Director of Next Gen Pastors, and serve M&A as the Director of Ecosystem Development. Homeostasis, it's from the Greek for steady and same, refers to any process that living things use to actively maintain stable conditions necessary to survival. The term was coined back in 1930 by physician Walter Cannon. His book, The Wisdom of the Body, describes how the human body maintains steady levels of temperature and other vital conditions like water and salt and sugar, protein, fat, calcium, oxygen, all of that we need to live. Similar processes dramatically maintain steady state conditions in Earth's environment. And all of this, of course, is an imperfect picture of the perfect homeostasis of our Lord. As Hebrews 13:8 says, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. But we know we live in a world full of change, and that change can create tension and resistance. We are designed to embrace homeostasis. We love consistency, but for that reason, people resist change because they believe they'll lose something of value or fear that they will not be able to adapt to new ways. Consider the changes that take place in any pastoral transition, especially for those churches for whom this is their first time there's a change in staff. For people who long for homeostasis, change in leadership, especially from the founding pastor to the successor, can be a big issue. Well, today we're going to discuss the change that takes place in pastoral transition. How should we think and prepare for the disruption that takes place when one pastor leaves and another one arrives? The church's homeostasis is disrupted, even more so when the change is from a founding pastor to a successor. I am pleased today to have with us Chris Polski, who has not only witnessed firsthand the effects of pastoral transitions, but has researched and written about them. Chris is the current and founding pastor of Trinity Church in Kirkwood, Missouri since 2007. Prior to that, he served as the first successor pastor at Golden Isles Presbyterian Church. Before that, he was a youth minister and assistant pastor at Twin Oaks Presbyterian Church. He's the visiting instructor in homiletics and polity at Covenant Theological Seminary, having earned his MDiv back in 2000 and completed his DMin at Covenant in 2021. Now, before we jump in, as always, this is meant to be a conversation. And so I want to invite you, as you're attending, to open up the chat box and send us some questions, or if you like, the Q&A box. If you're watching, I was going to say something about Facebook, but we're not live on Facebook because they changed it and I couldn't get on. I just want to say as we start, as a founding pastor who served for 26 years and transitioned 3.5 years ago to this new role, I know the travails and at times the pains that are involved for everyone in a church transition. I also know that transitions are complicated times. So for you, as we have this conversation, we're going to work through questions, and they may be questions you have. Keep in mind that there are issues in any given church transition that we just may not be able to discuss here in this format. However, we will share only what we think prudent, and we want to say nothing that might impugn the reputation of anyone else. So ask questions. We may say, that's a great question. We're not able to answer that one for the sake of those who are not with us. So having said that, Chris, welcome. Glad you're able to join us. Let's just start off. Why is this topic of interest to you? What got you interested? Tell us your story, please.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on to talk today. And thanks to all the guys who are being a part of this. Appreciate all of you and the work you're doing. For me, it really boiled down to some experiential things in my life. I'm a founding pastor now. You mentioned that 16 years into my current church. Things are going great, but I'm 53 years old, and I was really interested in the idea of how do I hand this church off in a healthy way? Because frankly, I'd seen some difficulties in the past. I served prior to this as a first successor pastor at a church and lived the experience of following in the footsteps of a founder in that location. And then I also witnessed kind of from the inside on a staff in another church prior to that, a very difficult and frankly painful transition for many people on all sides of the issue. And so I was very interested in this topic and doing my DMin research on it because I wanted to do something that would be practically helpful to brothers in the church and to sessions and to founding pastors and successor pastors to help give them some principles to navigate the very complex transition that takes place with a first founding pastor to a first successor.
Okay. Well, great. Well, thank you. Let's as we start off, I'm going to put a poll out there for everyone that's with us, and want to let me launch the poll. Let's just take a moment. It's just nice to see who's joining us. This is anonymous, but I don't think there's anything too sensitive in here. Well, want to know how many of you are a founding pastor, less than 7 or more than 7. Maybe you're a successor to a founder, or just a successor to a previous pastor, maybe in a long line, because the principles really apply to all contexts of transitions. But we're just particularly interested. I think there's unique issues or intensified issues when it comes from the first founding pastor, or his fingerprints all over everything, and it makes it a hard change. Or as some of you, we have a number coming in that are just none of the above, and that's great too. We're so glad you're with us. Perhaps you're a ruling elder, a member, because the topic is likewise very important. We have most of our people having answered. I'm going to end the poll and share those results. So you should all be able to see this now. And I should remove the pin so it's just not you right now. 1 second. There we go. So it looks like a quarter of our people are more than 7 years. No one is saying they're fewer than 7, which I think that's going to be an interesting point to discuss of what should church planters be thinking about as far as succession if they've just particularized, but we'll get to that. Yeah. We got 20% who are successors and 15% who are in a chain, of pastors, and then 40%, good number, are none of the above, and that's great. I think I really appreciate that we have a good mix going on. Well, great. Well, thank you so much. It kind of gives us a sense of who's there. So, Chris, to tell us a little bit, what were some of the surprises you found when you did your research? Maybe describe the research you did, and without getting real technical.
Right. What methodologies? Well, my main methodology was the wonderful tool of Facebook. I asked some Presbyterian pastors and elders on the Facebook pages if they could point me to some churches that had successful transitions. And I got tons of feedback from that, names of guys, names of churches that I should contact, because my original idea was I was going to talk to some churches that had done this well, that had thrived and things had been awesome. And so I picked up the phone and I made probably about 3 dozen phone calls. And again, these were all churches recommended to me as having had healthy transitions. And what I found at the end of that is literally none of them met the requirements of a healthy transition, which for me meant things like, did the founding pastor leave happy? Was his family happy? Was the first successor pastor able to remain around at least 3 years and be happy? Was there a dramatic dip in attendance or giving? Was there major turnover on the staff or the session? Did the church have to rename itself or relaunch itself, or did it close completely? Was there a split involved or a splant involved? And really, of the 36 or so churches I talked to, all of them had one of those criteria to them. Now, some of the churches were doing fine now, but they'd left a lot of damage prior to that in the life of the founding pastor. Or some of them, the founding pastor was happy, he got what he wanted, but it was an unintentional interim that followed him, and he was just the guy after the next guy, and there was damage there. So I was very surprised by that. I was also surprised by the fact that when I started to get into the conversation with people, how few churches and leadership teams and founding pastors are even thinking about succession planning. It seems that most of us are so consumed, and understandably so, with making sure our churches are thriving and doing well, and we're planning and doing ministry, that it's just not on the radar for most of us. It doesn't really come on most of our radar until we kind of hit, probably 60 for most guys. And my contention is it really should be on our radar from the very beginning. And we can talk about that a little bit later. So those were surprises. I think kind of led to the way I structured my dissertation research, which became more about the voices of all of the players in it and what they experienced from their perspectives. So that's what I ended up writing about.
Okay. Oh, that's great. Okay. Yeah. And so those criteria, it's helpful to know it's just not one single thing. Attendance maintained, at least maybe drop a few percentage, but not huge, or and the sense of contentment on one side or the other, that because sometimes a successor pastor may not feel.
Yeah. And I understand some people have said, well, those aren't spiritual criteria. And I get that. I understand that. Those are the kind of intangible measures. You know, a Scottish revival can break out anywhere where you lose 25% of your people, but you love Jesus more. So I get that. But there had to be some measure for developing the research criteria. And so I did that. And I looked, another thing is just at PCA churches, and I focused on kind of mid-sized PCA churches because that's where most of us are. I didn't look at Redeemer in New York or Briarwood. Most of us don't live in that kind of a world. So this was more based on a regular PCA church context.
You know, as we think through this issue of transition, you use some analogies that were helpful because it's a complex topic, and to be able to talk about it by analogy can help us kind of gain some perspective. What were the analogies that are kind of helpful for us to think about the transition?
Well, I looked at two biblical analogies, just did some research on those, and those were the transitions that took place from Moses to Joshua, and then later the transition that took place from Samuel to Saul, just because those were two pretty hefty sections of scripture that had a lot of narrative descriptions of the relationship or lack of relationship between the men involved. So there's a lot of work there. But in terms of practical associations, I looked mostly at small businesses, founding entrepreneurial type businesses, and wanted to see how entrepreneurial business owners made transitions in their small companies. And what we found out there was about only a third of small businesses make it to a second generation, and only 10% make it to a third generation. And I thought that was very interesting because some of the factors relate to what churches do. Maybe the richer vein of application was in the area of a step family. What I tried to do there was associate the founding pastor with, say, like a biological father in a home, and the session or leaders of the church like the biological mother. And then for whatever reason, whether it's death or divorce, the biological father's gone and a stepfather comes in. Let's call that person the first successor pastor. And then the children, the biological children in that family are like a congregation. So I did a lot of reading and research on step families and the dynamics in step families, and looking at the things that a stepfather experiences when he moves into a home. What pressures are on the mom as she navigates loving her new husband, but listening to her children? What pressures are on the kids who are like, you're not my dad. What are you telling me to do? And then what kind of pressures does that actual stepfather face when he tries to navigate the existing relationship between the mom and the kids? And I actually come from a home where my parents were divorced when I was 7. So that was a very interesting kind of exploration for me as I thought back on my own childhood. But that was a very rich vein of kind of emotional, psychological, and spiritual application that we looked at.
Yeah. It's a wonderful analogy. It kind of give us the initial discomfort, but going, this wasn't a divorce, but does it feel like there's been a break?
And actually, you could take and say, hey, when a founding pastor leaves and he's upset or he's forced out, it is a little bit like a divorce. Not exactly. I mean, we've got biblical guidelines for divorce, but there's a rift and a break that's painful. And when a pastor dies or departs the scene because he's called elsewhere, that's a little bit like a death, and it is a death in some practical situations. So the dynamics there are different.
But it just helps give some credence to the emotional response. We can intellectually say, God called this person somewhere else. That's a good thing. God's calling a new pastor. That's a good thing. But the way it might be felt and perceived by the congregants, the session.
Yes.
To that point, then, what do you think makes these transitions so difficult? What's happening that we're maybe not attuned to in this
Yeah.
context?
Well, I think there's a few things. One is founding pastors, and this is one of my main points we'll get into in a few minutes. They make a unique mark. All long-term pastors, or what we call legacy pastors, make a unique mark. But there's something about a founding pastor that's a little bit different. They set the tone. They establish an initial DNA. They kind of act like white blood cells in a new organism to keep threats out. They become like a hub of ministry. Most founding pastors are the only paid person on a staff, so they do everything. And it's that way early on in the life of a church. And then I think they also they kind of synergize or organize various perspectives into a common ministry approach, and that's a little bit unique to a founding pastor. Whereas a guy that comes in and he has a legacy ministry, but he's not the first guy. He's doing some of that kind of stuff, but there is a pre-existing DNA that he's having to react to. And I think that makes it a little bit different. So that's a big thing that's different, I think, in terms of making it a challenge. I also think just that emotional or visceral connection that people have with a founding pastor. I mean, he did the first baptism. He did the first wedding. He preached the first sermon. You know, he was the guy who helped organize the transition from mission to founding. He was the guy in your living room begging you to get on board and giving you a place to work. And you had a small group of people who had these very intimate connections. And as time goes on, whether it happens fairly soon, 7 or 8 years, or it goes on 20, 30 years, those bonds are incredibly deep. And when change occurs, even if it's good-natured change like a retirement, it's still a severing of a bond that is unlike any other bond, except for maybe like that biological father. So I think those make it really challenging. And one other thing I'd say, and you experienced this, any of us who've been a founding pastor and poured our lives into an organization for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, it's like a child to us. And to say goodbye to them or give them away to someone else, like you were talking about earlier, you're giving your child away in marriage. I mean, it's hard. It's hard for us to let go.
Yeah.
Which is unique, I think, as well.
Yeah, and you know, with that analogy, it's hard to let go, but we raise them for that purpose, or at least that's what we keep reminding ourselves.
That's what we should have done. Yes.
But when it comes to the church, there's not a natural transition for us. It kind of happens to us. It's more like I don't know if this analogy works. They ran away and eloped, you know, because we don't have a ceremony or a mechanism.
Yeah, and then in the case of
votes, which isn't really warm and fuzzy, necessary, but difficult.
In the case of guys that are listening today that might be retired from their vocational careers, all of these brothers understand that the hard transition of letting go of one big part of your life. Who am I? What do I do? Where do I go? And a lot of founding pastors that are there for a long time, and they're only looking at retirement at the end of it. They're facing the double whammy of letting this thing go that they birthed. This is more like the kind of the founding entrepreneurial analogy, but they got to let that go. And then they got to figure out, who am I and what am I going to do with the next 10, 15, 20 years of my life that the Lord's going to give me to be productive in ministry if it's not here. And that's very scary, I think, for a lot of us.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And we're getting some questions in. I see in the Q&A box. We're gonna get to those in a minute because we're gonna invite two others to join us. Joining us are two pastors who've experienced both sides of transition. And if there's anything I need to do, guys, you can come on in, unmute. Put your camera back on. There we go. We have Barry Henning of New City Fellowship, St. Louis, where that church, he's been living and working out the issues of reconciliation and justice since 1992. Urban areas of North St. Louis and University City. Barry and his wife, Ann, live in the inner city community, St. Louis. He married, has 4 married children and 20 grandchildren. And John Penny Legion is with us. Penny was born and raised in Burlington, Ontario, graduate of Covenant Seminary with a MDiv and a THM. He's pastor of Christ the King in Roanoke, Virginia since 2016. Penny is married to Kat, and they have 2 daughters and a son. So, guys, welcome. Glad you could join us. And take a moment, Barry, why don't you start? Describe what transition looked like in the context of New City Fellowship.
Sure. As for everybody, it is a little bit of a complex story, but overall, it was really, really good. So I'd been the founding pastor and was there for 25 years in that founding and senior pastor role. And about 16 years in, I really began praying, okay, Lord, who's on the horizon? Not immediately, but just on the horizon. And we'd hired an associate pastor that I thought, this guy maybe really could be the next senior pastor here. And so he served with us for 9 years, and I involved him in virtually everything I did. We shared the preaching load together, and we just worked through all kinds of things in terms of the congregation. And after 9 years, the congregation, we led them through a process, which we can talk about later, but he was accepted and elected almost unanimously to become the next senior pastor of the church. And the process overall was incredibly good and incredibly encouraging. What was in the cards for us, so to speak, that none of us anticipated was just right after the 3-year mark of being senior pastor. He then announced that he felt like God was calling him to another church in another part of the country. And that did cause a lot of good wrestle. But the session accepted his resignation as senior pastor, and the congregation did, the session did. And then they immediately asked me if I would step back in as interim senior pastor. And so now we are beginning now, just getting through COVID and everything, we're just beginning the process of beginning to look for the next new senior pastor.
Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. And getting a little feedback here. Penny, why don't you tell us about, now you're the successor to a founder.
I am, yeah. So our founding pastor, the man who planted our church, was here for roughly about 7-ish years. Began the church, saw it particularized, and then was called away to another call. And so I came in roughly about a year to 18 months after he departed, and was the second pastor, and was the only pastor on staff when I came on, and was here, very, very quickly after that. We were hiring new staff and bringing people on and whatnot. But yeah, so I came from another state, another place, not knowing anyone, not really having any connection to this place, coming as an associate pastor to the senior role. So yeah.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you. So let's and again, we've got some, keep asking questions. We're gonna get to them in a minute, but what's one key thing from both of your experiences that if you were to give advice, what would it be? What to do or what not to do in the context of a transition? And it may not relate to your experience, but just maybe things you've seen. So this can be a bit more, you can make it anonymous. You can say, I heard a story once.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that Chris mentioned in his descriptions about the church, to me, is very critical, which is to make sure that the leadership of the church, outside of the pastor, the senior pastor, make sure the leadership of the church, and as much as possible, most of the congregation, really know what the congregation needs next. Do they need renewal? Do they need to reshape, remold? Do they need to strike out in some new areas of ministry and vision and be challenged? Are they a very active congregation already with things well set up? And with a lot of ministries in place? So we're a multi-staff church. And so anybody we call, a lot of what we will be looking for is someone who has vision for the future, but also knows that deepening and strengthening and expanding what already exists has got to be part of their vision and what they're committed to. And so the more the church knows what it needs, I think the better the process will go. And then just being faithful for however long that takes. We are expecting this next phase to be anywhere from 2 to 5 years. And we know that's likely given the context of who we are as a multi-ethnic church. And just knowing God's got the church, he's going to lead you, but it's so helpful to know really what are you looking for that next pastor to do for you.
That's helpful. We're going to get to this in a minute, Chris, as we go through your principles. But what Barry mentioned reminds me of the thing that I found so helpful in your work. When we think of transition, we think a pulpit committee. Just let's get them in there, let's interview, and we do all this good work. But knowing the congregation, just briefly describe having that other group that's different.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm really working on is trying to differentiate between a pulpit search process and what I call a succession planning task force. And in my view, a lot of people want me to kind of help during the transition. And what I'm really specializing in or talking about is things that should be happening 5-10 years before you get to the transition, so that your transition is the pathway is smooth, or at least smoother. I understand no transition is easy, but and what I recommend there is a group called a Succession Planning Task Force, which is a combination of session members, congregants. It's like a pulpit search committee. It's not a pulpit search committee, but it's like it in that it could be structured in some different ways with a lot of session input. And then the critical question is the founding pastor going to be on that group? And that's good if he's eager to be a cooperative member of the succession planning. It could be problematic if he's resisting. And there is something called founder syndrome, where a founder won't ever let go. And in that case, you have to push through that because the organization needs leadership so that it can be sustained. So I really recommend a succession planning task force, which I can describe in more detail when we get a little bit later into this, if you'd like.
But you said 5-10 years out thinking about this.
Yeah.
I don't know what I'm preaching on Sunday, and you're asking.
Right.
We'll get to that later. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Any thoughts, Penny, on that?
Yeah, I think that I think coming in as a successor pastor, being the number 2 guy, there's an inclination to want to try and distinguish yourself from the previous guy, particularly, and kind of put your own stamp on it. Because I think we all recognize that whatever you're moving into is going to have the fingerprints of the founding pastor all over it. And I would just encourage people to resist that inclination to set yourself up almost in opposition to the guy who came before. And instead, I think what was helpful was, as I came in, was trying to be patient. So being patient, asking lots of questions, and then really kind of celebrating the things that the previous pastor was that I'm not. And to the point that I actually even wrote him a letter about 8 months in and just said, I see all these things that our church is, and I'm thankful for, and I know that's because of who you are. So, and so I just think, wanting to not memorialize in an unhealthy way, but still appreciate the Lord used this person, used this man. And so this is a good thing. So let's remember him in that way, even as we're progressing on.
Yeah,
So
that helps. Yeah, remember the old photographs from Stalinist Russia, where each iteration of the picture, people that fell out of favor were erased. We don't want to do that in the context of the church. We want to be able to remember and celebrate God's faithfulness. Yeah, I think you mentioned the letter. that you wrote. I think how wonderful that is. There is a common tradition among U.S. presidents to, as they are leaving, to put a note on Inauguration Day for the incoming administration to, in the old Resolute desk in the Oval Office, to leave a note for the next pastor. What do you think, just, your immediate response, what would be helpful to be in that note? What would you want to say to the next pastor that would encourage and help bring stability?
Well, there's a few things. Of course, you have to limit it.
Yes. One thing. This is one of 3 by 5.
That's right. That's right. So I would say one of the things to me that's so crucial is just for the pastor to recognize that God has given this congregation gifts and vision from the Holy Spirit, to bring His kingdom and His glory to expression. And it is the pastor's job not to control the church, but to serve it by faithfully preaching the gospel and looking to equip these people for the ministry and the vision God's given them in pursuing the kingdom. And the other thing I would just say is your session is a gift. Your session is a gift from God for you and for the congregation. And you're really a part of a team, a great team of people. And that ultimately the responsibility for wisdom and decision rests with the session as a whole, along with the confirmation of those things from the congregation as they step into them. But just taking that burden off of your shoulders, that I'm the guy who has to make this work. No, you're not, and you'll never be.
Recognizing this is not my church, and it never has been. I've been a steward, not an owner.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that something that Chris has talked about in his dissertation, the fact that so the founding pastor has left and there's now a successor pastor. Well, there's going to be another pastor after you. Like one day you're going to leave. And so this really isn't, as Barry was saying, this isn't your church. This is the church that you are to steward and care for. But one day you won't be the pastor. It might be you move, it might be you're called away, it might be that you retire or you pass away. But Lord willing, that particular church will be around long after you are. So hold it lovingly and loosely. So.
Yeah.
Chris, I would add to that. Mine would be, not to be too flippant about it, but it would be one sentence, and it would be something like, "I got your back," or what he said. I think we have to swallow our own pride and say, I am all in making sure that this guy, unless he denies Jesus or some fundamental doctrine of the faith, that you've got him, you've got his back, and you're there to support him, and you'll do whatever you can. That's key to me.
Yeah, when we transitioned as the associate pastor coming in as the senior pastor, which is a whole nother thing in there, but multiple times I just said to this man, I want you to know that the thing that is going to bring me the greatest joy is you succeeding. Mm-hmm. And whatever I can do to help make that happen, that's what I'm here for.
Yeah.
Amen.
And I'll just I'll add fuel to that one, because the founding pastor of my church isn't in town anymore. He lives in another state, and yet he has multiple times said things to me like, "You are the right man for this time." And that kind of support, even though it's, he's not saying it before everyone, he's just saying it to me, is incredibly, it just is incredibly helpful and encouraging, and to know that he's for me and for the church, it's empowering.
Yeah.
So.
It's helpful. I have a couple questions here. Now, the one question is, what advice, Chris, would you have for pulpit committees seeking a pastor to replace the founding pastor? You mentioned a little bit about strategic planning, and as there's time, we'll touch on that. Is there anything else that that you would tell a pulpit committee specifically in that?
Yeah, of course, everything depends on the context of a situation. But what I say in those situations is, have you done the hard work of sorting out who you are? I'm not talking about kind of a general pulpit committee analysis, a couple surveys. I'm talking about trying to discern what it was about the founding pastor's way of doing ministry that got embedded into the bedrock of your church. You got to understand that before you're even ready to do a search. And then Barry mentioned this earlier. I think you got to discern, is your church generally a church going in the right direction and happy? In which case you're looking for a guy who should be a lot like the guy that left. If the church is struggling or stagnating, or there's been some kind of difficulty, then a lot of times a change agenda is on target for that church. But either way, you got to know what you're changing from or conforming to. And I think most pulpit committees make a mistake in the sense that they look at, let's say a pastor has 10 qualities about him, and the previous pastor was really good at 6 or 7 of them, but maybe not so good at 3 or 4 of them. Well, what they do is they go out and they try to find the guy who's good at the 3 or 4 that the previous pastor wasn't good at. And they often do find that. But what they get in exchange is they get a loss of 3 or 4 qualities that the previous pastor was good at, because none of us are good at all 10. And if that was part of the DNA of the church, then you've messed with the DNA. Okay. You might get a very dynamic preacher or somebody who's great with people, or whatever you might want to mark off as a really important part of pastoral ministry. But and I think of Frank Barker in this way. Frank Barker, with all due respect, I think the thing people loved about Frank wasn't so much he was this most awesome preacher, but he motivated people to do ministry. And so, what that church really was going to thrive in was somebody that could keep that moving in the right direction, rather than just become the most awesome pulpiteer in history. And I think that on the lower level, the more minuscule level of the average church, is something you have to take into account before you even enter a pulpit committee process. And it's something you should be taking account of, like I said, 5, 10, 15 years beforehand.
No, that helps. Question here of, is there a connection between the duration of the time a founding pastor is there and the success of the transition? So founding pastor saying for 3 years or 30 years. What are your thoughts, each of you, on that?
I'll say quickly, I'll let the other guys jump in, but I mean, I think the main off ramps for pastors are 3 years, 7 years, 12 years, and then their legacy. So the first off ramp, I don't know that you have time to make a big imprint if it's a 3-year pastorate. Now, if you're a founding pastor, maybe a little bit, and that's another whole topic of discussion, whether we need to empower guys to do that 3 years and then go. If they're there more than 7 years there, I think you're going to have to do some disentangling work, or at least some identification work. And if they're there more than 12 years, you got a founder who is a legacy pastor, and that's a heavy burden that has to be dealt with in that church. So,
yeah, we've done a webcast sometime last year on interim pastors, which is a concept and a category we really don't talk much. It's not in our BCO, that language. It's just
right.
Why. But the benefit of thinking through that interim to help the transition, because one of you mentioned the unintended interim, that successor who's just there for a few years. Difficult.
So I would throw in just a little bit. It does depend. There's a lot of factors.
Mm-hmm.
It can go great after 30 years. It can go poorly. It can go great after 7 years. It can go poorly. Mm-hmm. A lot of things. One of the things for us, and I know we aren't typical in this sense, but because we were multi-ethnic and reconciliation focused from the beginning, I shared the pulpit from the go. So we had, from literally week 6 or so of the planting of the church, we had at least 2 voices in the pulpit. And then as time went on, we got even more voices in the pulpit. Now, what I did as a senior pastor was I still preached at least half the time, and then shared it with these other guys the other half. But what that does is it makes the congregation have a sense of stability that isn't rooted on one person. And it's a very different thing to transition if you're especially the sole pastor and the sole preacher. To me, that's a really hard transition for a whole lot of reasons. I'll just tell you, it's very different when you're used to having multiple preachers, multiple voices. It just is, I think it's a really good benefit.
And that, by the way, this is something that I call a healthy transition pathway. What Barry's describing there is he created an environment in his church where the transition in the pulpit was not a difficult transition because it was a shared pulpit. I know of other situations where pastors that dominate the pulpit for one reason or another, maybe because they don't have anybody else, maybe because they choose to, maybe because they're the most awesome preachers in the world and people want them to preach all the time. But when that voice exits the pulpit by choice or retirement or death or whatever, you're going to have a really complicated situation on your hands because they're used to kind of an idiosyncratic view of what constitutes good preaching. And that is that guy's preaching. So Barry created an environment at his church where the congregation was regularly exposed to different voices. Now you got to figure out what your percentages look like. It may be 50-50, it may be 60-40, I don't know, but I think it needs to be over the course of your ministry. If you're a long-term pastor, founding pastor, you need to be actively looking to replace your voice in the pulpit as much as you can. That's a healthy transition pathway that makes it an easier transition for the next person.
Yeah. That's great. That helps.
Yeah, I would just also add, like, not just preaching. I mean, I do think that that's huge. So we have 3 pastors on my staff now, and we share. I do the majority of the preaching, but the other 2 pastors preach. They also preach within the series, so they're not preaching their own separate thing when they preach. They're preaching the next passage. But then there's other ways that you can kind of share the pastorate, if you will. Like, I don't have to be the one who's always making every decision. You need to talk to the associate of this or that. And in fact, there are many times where I can say, I don't know. You know, someone asked me a question on a Sunday and the answer is, I don't know. You need to talk to so-and-so because I don't need to know. That's why we have a shared leadership. And so I don't think it's just I think preaching is absolutely helps in that transition, but also the other aspects of ministry are other people giving voice to leadership. So that
Amen.
when I'm on sabbatical, when I'm on vacation, no one's going, oh my gosh, we're going to fall, right? Like, no, we have leaders. And so one day when I leave, there will be leaders there too. And so.
Yeah, I think just in that one point, again, this is part of the long-term planning. Is you mentioned sabbatical there. I would think there would be wisdom in planning a sabbatical several years, not just the year before, then you're gone, but a couple years. So there's that institutional memory of, yeah, he was gone for 4 months and we didn't die. We made it.
Yeah.
We have a number of other questions I want to get to. But Chris, you in your work, you came up with 7 principles, and you post that to everyone. We're going to try to touch on some. Maybe let's call out a couple of them that you think will be really helpful.
Yeah.
For this, because again, the questions are coming in, which are great.
Right.
Love the questions. So yeah, go ahead.
The first one is most foundational, and Penny mentioned it. It is a mindset. If you envision yourself as an interim pastor, and if your leadership envisions you as an interim pastor in kind of this deeper philosophical sense, it will change the whole dynamic of the way that you lead. Now, I recognize we're not interim pastors, we're senior pastors, we're going to be there a while. I get all that. But if you were in a situation in which there was an interim pastor and you weren't making plans for the transition, you'd be negligent. And so I think that one kind of sets the tone for everything, that if everybody understands you're not going to be there forever, that's really important. I've talked about number 2. Number 3, I say plan for transition now, and I mean it. If you're there 3 years, 10 years, 20 years, here's the thing, guys. We could die tomorrow. You know, the bus test. We could, you read about moral failures. You read about church breakdowns and splits. You read about a guy getting a call and announcing he's leaving in 2 weeks. any of those can happen to anybody in almost any context. And so if a church doesn't have something in the works, then they tend to make bad decisions in anxious and critical, intense environments. So plan for it. I talked about number 4 with Barry, recalibrate your ministry for smoother transition. That's like, look at your preaching. Penny mentioned it too. Shepherding, leadership. How do you do these things, and how do you get other people to be critical players in the decision-making and leadership of those things? Mm-hmm. Number 5, transition isn't over when you start. People think, oh, we got the new pastor, we finished the transition. It's at least 3 more years before you really truly have transitioned, because that's when most of the breakdowns occur, in that first 3-year period. There's going to be loss. That's number 6. There's loss for the founding pastor. There's loss for the first successor pastor. There's loss for the leadership. There's loss for the congregation. When somebody leaves that's been there a while and laid a foundation, it hurts. And you can't make it not hurt. It's going to hurt. So be direct about that and talk about that with your leaders. And then number 7, if you've had a terrible, difficult time with the transition, I want to say I talked to a lot of churches that have been through really hard times, but they come out on the other side, and it's possible to heal and move forward. Don't quit, but do take the lesson, and don't wait yourself to think about succession until the pastor that's there now decides he's leaving. So those are my 7 principles that need to be unpacked in your unique context. And I think if you do that, you're going to make a lot more good decisions about this.
That's great. Question here from Stephen Cooper, and Carter Johnson question is similar but different. So we'll start with the one from Stephen. It says, what advice do you have for the new pastor when members of the congregation don't like him because he's different than the founding pastor? How do you handle that? What advice in navigating those orders would you suggest?
Penny, you should talk about that one first, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's inevitable. It's going to happen. And that's just the nature of, people gravitate towards other people. And so is it a personality thing? Is it a, relational thing? It may be that they still have this incredible fond relationship for the previous pastor. And so I would just say, it might actually have less to do with the success the pastor who's coming in, successor pastor, and it might actually have more to do with them just trying to transition through loss, and trying to navigate that. And so, I think all I would say is try to pursue them, be okay with them grieving the loss of the previous pastor as much as is healthy, and don't feel like you have to change who you are. Like, the Lord called you to be the successor, and that's an important piece. So
yeah. One of the things I'd throw in here that I know we all realize this, but it's just one of those obvious things you just have to keep stating, is that we grow through trial. We grow through struggle. One of the things we teach all of our church members in our discipleship classes is that we will have conflict. There's no getting around it. It's going to happen. The only question is it going to be constructive conflict, or is it going to be destructive? And just those godly principles of humility, listening, repenting, encouraging, being committed. I think some of these things, many of them are, to a certain degree, you can do your very best. We had a great transition. And then when the guy we transitioned to decided to leave after 3 years, it was like, wow, conflict. And it was so beautiful, and then it was so hard. And the church is a beautiful, beautiful, messy group. And so just remembering that, and that God is going to be faithful to enter the conflict. You don't have to be afraid of it, and really trust him to use these, because you're going to have these challenges. They're going to be there.
I just would add on that particular question, it's usually more complex than you're different. It's you got to find out what is it in particular. And I've focused on the four main areas I think a pastor is responsible for. That's preaching, leadership, or vision casting or strategy, shepherding, would be the three big ones I think that we're supposed to be involved in, but also just the way you develop leaders. So what's different about the way the successor pastor is doing it, and get people to try to articulate what it is. And I think you can learn a lot in that process, and then discern if it's the difference, or if it's loss, or if there may be actually a wise thing that was being done before that you didn't know about, that you could adjust to as a successor pastor. Because I do think, we don't want to lose all the wisdom of the previous pastor's contributions in the context of the church.
We have a question here from a founding pastor who's been there for 30 years. So we're talking founder, we're talking legacy. He says, my wife fears that transitional talk can lead people pulling away in an attempt to protect themselves from the pain of leaving and loss. So I'm going to leave you before you leave me, basically. He says, so how can this be minimized, especially if the transition talk is for years? He's looking to retire in 3 to 5 years. What are your thoughts on that? How do you help the people through that process?
Barry, you need to take that one. You've lived it.
Well, I would just say that remarkably, globally, I was with a group of pastors in Pakistan just a few years ago, and we were riding down the street and going to the church, and the pastor says to me, you see that man over there? I said, yeah. He said, well, he used to be one of our pastors. He took a group of folks from the church and left. And I'm thinking, in Pakistan, you're telling me Christians don't just bond together and stay in Pakistan? Some people are going to leave. You can't stop it. You can't guarantee it's not going to happen. And surprising who sometimes some of those people are. And a lot of that, again, is just resting in the fact that doesn't mean they're not sons and daughters of God. Doesn't mean that God doesn't love them. You may be hurt or disagree, and you hope it would never happen. But if it does, it's okay. God's got you. He's got them. You do want to do things to try to minimize that. But in most cases, some of that is almost inevitable.
Question we have here, and it's one that brings back memories for me. So probably in a 26-year, probably about 15 years into my my church, I began to talk about succession and what it might look like. And I had one elder say, don't mention that again. He said, because if you're talking about transitioning, we're going to talk about, well, let's start thinking about your leaving now. And it wasn't because we don't like you. Well, I don't think it was. But the reality there is, that's the question. How do you have a healthy succession plan that doesn't look like to the session or the leadership, the church, you've got a foot out of the door?
I'd say a couple things come to mind for me there. First of all, Moses and Joshua. The Lord told Moses that Joshua was going to be the leader long before Moses told the people. Okay, so I think that there is a conversation to be had behind the door of the session meeting about this topic, and there's a lot of complexities with that, but it doesn't have to be announced right away. I think maybe a little more controversial, I might say, well, is that so bad? Because the church is bigger than us, and if our people think that we are bigger than the church, and that, if you're gone, I'm gone, then we're perpetuating kind of a unique brand of American consumeristic salad bar Christianity. And I'm just going to go down the street to the other popular pastor, and we don't really want that. I know we can't stop that from happening, but if we can talk about succession openly and honestly. I started talking about it with our congregation when I did my dissertation, and when people come up to me, I've said, hey, look, we're not planning this anytime soon, but we are going to be thinking and praying about it, because we don't want to have a disaster here in the wake of when the day finally comes. And I think they've appreciated that. And I haven't sensed any loss of connectivity with my people. I'm only 53 years old, so I still have, Lord knows, 10, 15 years left before I would transition. But I think it's kind of part of the DNA now. We're a church that is willing to talk about that. It's like a family who's willing to talk about their estate planning. Some families don't want to do that. We don't talk about death here, but I found the ones that talk through it and they understand each other's wishes, and it actually creates a healthy opportunity for them to function as a family. So maybe my answer is controversial, but I think it's probably long-term healthier.
That gets back to the idea of homeostasis. We love it. It is a wonderful part of the created order, but so is change, and we have to be prepared for it.
Yeah, and I would say, to your point, Chris, too, just earlier, the more that you and your leaders are on board together, when you start talking about it, the better. If you just kind of randomly start talking about it, that's going to be a shock to everybody. So I think you should talk about it with your leaders before you talk about it publicly.
Oh, yeah. Someone asked here about your dissertation. So when does the book roll out, and where can I buy a copy? Now they want to, is it accessible?
Yeah, it is accessible. If people want to email me, polskychris@gmail.com. I'm working on a workbook that I'd like to get published through M&A or CDM, just kind of a simplified version of the dissertation for what you can be doing. And Chris actually can talk about, he's got a module with his next gen, especially maybe designed for younger pastors who've planted churches, things they should be thinking about that we collaborated on. And I've got a website, firstpastoraltransition.com, where I lay out a lot of things, and I'm happy to consult with people or spend time doing Zoom talks with your session if you want.
Right. No. And as Chris had mentioned, we have about 30 modules, and this is one that I think it's so helpful. We kind of put it under the category of cultural intelligence. It's helping your church's culture have a good, clear understanding of how to do this process. It really is critical. And again, if you're interested in that, contact me and I can talk you through that. We just have a few minutes left. Have another question here about what happens when the legacy pastor changes his mind. I'm leaving. Oops, no, I'm not. It happens, I know in small businesses and things like that. So it could happen here. Maybe if one of you want to touch on that, what would you say?
Guys, feel free to jump in. I think this is the most complex part of this, because there is this idea called founder syndrome, and it's in the book Next by Vanderbloemen, Bird, and Ortberg. But it's a pastor who says they want to transition, but they're looking for perfect. And so they never can find perfect except for themselves, really. And so there's never a time. And I think this is where we got to be Presbyterians. I hate to say it, but we got to believe kind of what our conviction is about polity and say the elders got to engage that more directly. And in a way, Barry and I have talked offline about this. A lot of times that guy doesn't want to go because he's afraid. He doesn't know what's next for him, or his financial situation is unstable. A lot of pastors are left kind of in the lurch without a good retirement plan. So he's just saying, I can't survive without this job. So the leaders have to understand that and say, hey, we want to make it so that you're not so afraid about this transition. Maybe Barry, you could say a word or two about that, because we've talked about that offline.
Yeah. I would just say, if there's a good, healthy dialogue that's been ongoing with your leaders, if the senior pastor gets to a point where he's like, wait, I'm changing my mind. Again, I agree with Chris. This is where we really submit to trusting God to use the wisdom of the elders to help us. And if you've got one guy who has that much control, it's probably not really healthy anyway. And you may just have to acknowledge that. It can feel a little bit rough, but I appreciate what you said, Chris. I think for many guys, if you've given 30 years of your life to a church, and you're getting ready to step aside, but you don't have any way of supporting your family, that congregation ought to be on their part looking to say, hey, what can we do to help you here? And maybe give you an extra set. I know one church that just said, we're going to pay you 75% of your salary until you die. Amen. But anyway, good, healthy relationship. If you have that, then submitting to the session and the church submitting to the wisdom of the session, I think is where it needs to go.
Great. Well, thank you. Thanks so much, guys. I'm going to throw something out just to engender conversation in the future. One thing we didn't touch on is what's the role of the presbytery in the context of transition? We think so much of the individual church, but there's an ecosystem. We won't get into that today. There's an ecosystem there, and how do we bring in the body, not as a court, but as brothers brothers and sisters in the Lord in that process. Well, thank you so much for your time. We've reached the end of our time here, and I want to thank you for joining with us. In 2 weeks, we'll be dealing with a coaching series, coaching for teams. We talk about coaching one-on-one a lot, but Vinny Torello is going to be talking about how do we coach a team and what can be done for sessions. It's not consulting, it's not just mediating, but it's coaching. So join us as we meet about every other week and have this process. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate your time, and thank you for being part of this M&A church planting and renewal conversation.